Okay. So, like I was saying, the virus is something that we have really been, that has been impacting our lives every single day. And so, a lot of times when we're in class, I feel like it's pretty typical for students to think, oh my God, when are we ever going to need to know this? Right. And that's why I feel like teaching and being so specific of talking about the virus and how viruses work. And today's class is going to be specifically talking about how coronavirus, COVID-19 works. And I feel like as a science teacher, I can make the argument that every single thing that we learn in class in biology, well, it's science in general, but specifically biology, pertains to our life every single day, and everything that we do, right? So, of course, I feel really passionate about that, but this is a unique opportunity for us to really take what we learn in class and understand the world around us just a little bit better. So I've got two videos. I decided to show videos mostly because they do a really great job of visualization. And we've been talking so much and reading and looking at pictures, which is great. It is a very one way of learning. But I think these videos do a pretty good job of explaining. And then, of course, I'll pause and kind of chat and answer any questions as we go through. So I have two videos, one of which you guys all seem pretty excited. I don't know how to pronounce it, but it's that one channel that you guys were really jazzed about when I showed it yesterday. So they did a really great job. And Christian, I think that you asked for me to play this video. It was up in the corner. So I did actually find it, and I am going to play that video first. So we're going to watch one of these videos, and it's going to be like a pretty layman explanation, which just means like everyday language. And then we are going to watch a video that's a little bit more technical. So what I'm trying to do here is play a video that hopefully will all understand at like in everyday language. And then once we have a basic understanding, we can then go into the technical, where it then kind of teaches us a little bit more using proper vocabulary words that we learned in this lesson. I really recommend that you guys have a piece of paper out if you would like to take notes, but there is no, it is not mandatory for you to take notes. If you would like, you can simply enjoy and watch. And for those of you who are not with us today and was not able to make it to a small group that's watching this recording, you can find the links to these videos in the description of this YouTube post or this YouTube video. So making sure that when I'm showing the video, you can pause and you can watch the video on your own and try to follow along with this recording. Okay, so for everyone else, let's go ahead and start the video. Are there any questions before we get started? Why don't we go ahead and throw some questions in general about what we may have about the COVID and coronavirus, right? So if you're like been wondering what's happening and you have some wonderings before we even start the video, why don't you go ahead and throw them into the chat? And let's be really intentional with our questions. So really focus your questions specifically about how COVID works. And not so much about the social, how should we behave kind of thing, right? So I'm going to give you guys a couple of seconds to go ahead and do that. So why don't you guys throw that into the chat? Come up with one question per person. Okay, good. How does the virus keep mutating? Great. Good. Anything else? One question per person. Christian got his out, so I'm waiting for some others. Okay, good question. Why haven't we seen the virus before? Awesome. What else? We've got 2 out of 5. So that means, sure, go ahead, Christian. You can do one more. Okay, good question, Avery. How many different mutations could there be? Good. So now I'm expecting 2 more from 2 more people. Christian, go ahead. You can answer. You can ask your second one. Okay, interesting question. I'm going to go ahead and say no on that one, Christian. It was not. All right. We're going to go ahead and get started with the video. All right. Good. How long was the virus present before it began affecting us? Good question. And last one more. Spencer, we've got you. Are you there? All right. Your question. Did you already ask a question about the coronavirus before we get started? Yes, Christian. That is correct. All right. Okay, so I already want to pause. Like I told you, I'm going to be pausing and talking quite a bit. So we call it SARS-CoV-2. But I think it's really important to know what that SARS stands for. Severe acute respiratory syndrome. So what this is telling us that it specifically attacks our respiratory system, which makes sense, right? A lot of the symptoms are coughing, dry coughs, and really hard to breathe, right? Those are two of the symptoms, as well as fevers and so forth. But specifically, this title is related to the where it actually is going to affect us specifically. Okay, why is it not considered a living thing? Okay, so tell me more about that. So it's a virus. Yes, it is. So remember in yesterday's lesson, I talked about a couple of things that the virus does not have, or does the characteristics that it contains that allows it to not be considered living, right? Do you remember what one of those things are? What is something that a virus does not do that keeps it from being considered living? Hmm. There were 7 characteristics of life, right? So in order for something to be considered living, there were 7 characteristics that it needed to meet. There are 4 characteristics that the virus does not meet. Reproduce, good, it cannot reproduce on its own. Good, yes, Christian, that's great. What else? What other things would it not do? What's something that is really specific to living? If you were, think about a plant. What are one of the things that a plant does? Carry proteins. Actually, this does carry proteins. It makes proteins. So not carry proteins, but you're close. It needs to be able, and it's something to do with mitosis. What does mitosis allow for things to do? One of the factors of mitosis. They can't do photosynthesis. They don't take energy in from the environment. So remember that in order for something to be considered living, they need to be able to either make their own food or get food from their environment. And a virus doesn't need food. It doesn't need to metabolize, right? So those are a couple of key things that something, in order for it to be living, does. Okay, so there's a huge argument about whether or not viruses are alive. And so there we go. Let's keep watching. I also want to comment that this video was made in 2020 in the beginning of when the coronavirus came out. So there are some things that they're going to talk about in this video that we now know and is may looks a little different. Okay. So let's pause here. How is this different? Right? So remember that in our lesson yesterday, and if you weren't in whole group yesterday, that's totally fine. But yesterday we talked about bacteriophage. Bacteriophage are viruses that specifically attack bacteria cells. And it looks a little different than this guy, right? A lot of you were mentioning how it is yeah, so a lot of you guys are mentioning about how the bacteriophage looked like a lot of aliens, right? How there is a different movies and characters where they like basically copied or were inspired by bacteriophage, viruses that specifically attack bacteria. This, however, is not bacteriophage. This is a virus that looks, first of all, the shape is different, right? When we were talking about bacteriophage, we know that there was like a head, the body, and then it looked like these like alien like things that came and they landed on the cell. How is this different? How is this virus different than the bacteriophage that we learned about yesterday? What's different about this? Let's talk about the shape. How is this different shape than what we saw with bacteriophage yesterday? Okay, exactly. Good. This one has like a key, right? The other one didn't. The other one just needed to land on it, and it was on the bacteria cell and was able to puncture through the cell of the membrane and then put in its DNA. In this case, we have, when it comes to more complex organisms, we have something more like a lock and key mechanism, right? We talk about the importance of structure and function, and this is one of them. So there's a specific shape that these viruses can hit and get a receptor on the outside of one of your cells, specifically talking about your lung cells, right? The tissues that make up, that line your lungs. And when the virus has this specific lock and key, it hits and it locks into one of these receptors that are on the outside of the cell membrane. And it says, oh, I've got one that fits. This guy must be good news. And then it comes in and puts in the no, I have not seen that show. Do not distract. I have to read the book first before I can watch the show. Okay, no more distraction. So then the DNA puts the coronavirus or COVID can then put its DNA into our cell.
What's happening executes the new instructions, which are pretty simple. Copy and reassemble. It shows up with more and more.
Okay, so really quickly, now they're moving into explaining a little bit about your immune system, which we are going to get to this quarter. It's probably going to come in the next week or so. But typically, what happens is, when we get an invader in our body, it triggers or signals to our immune system that there is an invader and they come and they start to attack it. Now, what's happening here is that the coronavirus actually takes over some of your immune cells and make it kind of like the video said, scream bloody murder, right? And so once they come, they then start to like overreact, which means you use and expend a lot of energy, right? So now we have a situation where, when you think about it, when people who have had COVID, if you know someone or if you've read the reports, they say very exhausted. You're extremely tired. Well, this is why. You're literally talking about how your body is giving too many resources. It's using way too much energy to attack it, which then kind of leads to your body being really tired, which allows the bacteria or the virus to take over even more. And we're going to learn a little bit more about how these two specific immune cells are going to even get worse. And yes, Christian, if we have time, but remember we have 2 videos that I want to watch. And then we're going to learn about vaccines again, specifically when we get to immune systems. And so that way we have a little bit more background information when we're talking about vaccines. Okay, remember, so this was made back in last March of 2020, which is right when it started to, we had to shut down. So just know that this video was made last year, and we now have a better idea of how many people have it and had it, right? And how many deaths that have been associated. So just keep in mind, this is not up to date to today, right? Okay. So this was a couple of things that we have known, and these are things that we were told in the beginning, right? And so this video, like I said, was created at the beginning of the pandemic to help understand what was happening. And now that we've learned about viruses in general and we've lived through it for about a year now, what are your thoughts on this video? Tell me a couple things that you learned, whether that's about the virus itself or, if we're reflecting on practices. Tell me a little bit about what you're thinking after watching this video. Bueller, when will it be gone? I think that the video really answered that. It really depends on our behaviors, right? So it really depends on people's behavior. And at this point, it doesn't, yeah, it will, Spencer, it will. This cannot go on forever. It just depends on how we approach it. And luckily, we do have a vaccine. So that should hopefully help. And there's a lot of research that has gone in and time that has gone in to make sure that it is super safe and it is okay for us to get it, right? For some, right? Yeah, there definitely are some side effects. And we are going to learn about the vaccine and what makes this vaccine so different than the other ones, too. What else did you guys learn? So, what did you learn about the virus? What did you guys figure out? Why? How is this different than the flu? How is this? What are the impacts that this coronavirus has on the body? What did we see about the predictions in the video about if we behave this way or if we behave that way, and what actually happened? So these are some questions that you should be answering right now. So whether you take yourself off of mute, or if you type it. Okay, so it's a mutated version of the flu, kind of. So let's be careful with that language. So it's not a version of the flu. It's not the flu. It is, they compare it to the flu in the sense of severity. So COVID-19, the disease that's caused by the the coronavirus, it is actually its own type of virus, but it is worse, right? Why is it worse than the flu? How is it worse than the flu? Why is it worse than the flu? They talked about it briefly in the video. It spreads faster and is more effective. Yes, it is more dangerous than the flu because it goes so fast. It multiplies so fast. So let's think about this. If we know that this is a faster spreading virus, does this virus go through directly into the lytic cycle, or does it go through the lysogenic cycle first? Remember my amazing explanation yesterday with there we go. Yes, the lytic cycle. Exactly. And I really am going to pretend it's all because of my analogy that I made with Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, not to brag. But yes, it goes right into the lytic cycle, right? The lysogenic cycle is when it becomes part of the bacteria, and that we are talking about. Yesterday, I was explaining bacteria. And then when the right conditions occur, it turns on. But in this case, they're not waiting for the right conditions. It's just going. Let's also think about where it affects us. Where does it attack us in our bodies? Thank you. I appreciate having earned bragging rights. Where does the coronavirus attack? The lungs, yes. And so if we think about when we're talking about how easy it is to spread as well as how it affects us, the coronavirus is going right into our lungs and our throats. And then when it attacks our lungs and throats and makes it harder for us to breathe, we tend to cough. And when we cough, it's going right back out. And that's one of the reasons why it's so easy for us to spread this, is because when it's attacking our lungs and our throats, and then we cough it out, which is right in our lungs and our throats, and then it gets into the air and it can linger in the air. We know that it has the ability to survive on surfaces. We know that, it can exceed in temperatures, and that is why you have to wear a mask, right? That's why we say wear a mask. That's why we say wash your hands, because that's how easy it can be spread and given off and then directly into our lungs. I mean, that's like one of the first things that bacteria and viruses come into our bodies, right? It comes in through our lungs, and if these guys attack the lungs, then we have this cyclical problem. I know. Okay, so that was one video. I want to spend some time showing you guys a second video. And this video is going to give you an explanation of the virus again, but the thing I like about this video is it gives you a bit more context and connects to some vocabulary words that we use in our lessons, right? So it's going to talk a little bit more about how this virus is an RNA virus. So it's going to really bring in some more scientific terms. So now that we have like a basic understanding of how the COVID works in our bodies and how it affects us, and we use that kind of everyday language, we're going to now use a little bit more scientific language. So again, I'm going to ask you roughly the same questions that I did in the first video, but I want you guys to be answering more, right? And using the proper vocabulary words. And there are 5 of you here. So I expect there to be more participation than the last video, all right? And again, for those of you who are watching this as a recording, the video link to this is in the description in the video, in the YouTube video. Okay. Okay, so we just learned that coronavirus got its name because of the spikes that are the outside of the virus, right? So really thinking about what they just said when it comes to how the parts of it. So inside has the genetic material, right? And then it has this like layer to protect it, and then it has another layer, and then we have these spikes. And those spikes are going to be the ones that are specific to the lock and key method, right? So let's go ahead and learn a little bit more.
repurposing it to build the components of new viruses. When an infected person talks, coughs, or sneezes, droplets carrying the virus may land in your mouth or nose and then move into your lungs. Once inside your body, the virus comes in contact with cells in your throat, nose, or lungs.
Okay, couple things here. So remember, there are different types of DNA or viruses. There's the DNA kind and the RNA kind. Now we've had a chance to learn about DNA and protein synthesis. So they just used a couple of key vocabulary words. So before I ask you this question, I want to go ahead and just re-explain it. So we've got this coronavirus. They say that typically, right, there's this lock and key mechanism that gets brought in. The cell membrane allows it in. Remember, the cell membrane is selectively permeable, meaning it only allows certain proteins to come in. And so in this specific case, they were able to have a lock and key. Remember that form and function. So the form was right. They were able to connect. And then the membrane was like, oh, like I know you, I must know you, right? So then they welcome it into the cell. Now, what they were just talking about was that typically when you got viruses that have DNA, the membrane would give it a like enclosure, a sac that would allow it to travel to the nucleus where it would meet with your DNA. But this one is different, right? We know that the coronavirus actually works with RNA, right? And we've heard of RNA before. We've heard of something called mRNA. So tell me, how is this related? And then it goes to the ribosome. So tell me, give me a prediction. What's going to happen here? We know that the coronavirus doesn't need to go to the nucleus. It can go right into just our cells and go right to the ribosome. What's going to happen here? What's that connection between what we know through DNA synthesis? We've heard words like mRNA. Now we're seeing coronavirus with RNA and ribosomes. So what's going to happen next? What's your prediction? Yes, you can.
It's most likely going to attack the lungs.
Before it attacks the lungs, right? Yes, it is going to. But when it enters your cell, how does it make more copies of itself?
Oh, by injecting itself into the cell itself, something like that.
Yeah, good. Yeah, so it's going to inject itself into the cell. It's going to release the DNA or the RNA. And if it releases that RNA, then how does it use your cell's machinery to create more copies of itself?
It injects its little proteins into the cell, and then it bursts open, creating more cells.
Okay, close. You're really, really close. You're really close. So it's not that it's going to inject proteins, right? Because what's the ribosome's job?
I don't remember.
Okay, no problem. Does someone else remember what the ribosome's job does? What does the ribosome do? Thinking about in protein synthesis, what does that ribosome do? Right? What part does it play when it comes to protein synthesis? Yeah, so yes, it does take place, right? And so the ribosome, we know this, right? When we learned about protein synthesis, we know that there's that process of translation or transcription to translation. So typically our cells, when our cells go to make the proteins, it takes that DNA, right? RNA makes that complementary strand and then sends that mRNA to the ribosomes. And what do the ribosomes do with the mRNA? Remember, these are the words that we use for like codon, tRNA, amino acids, right?
It
Those are,
changes the code.
yeah, it starts to build, it reads the mRNA and starts to build those proteins. So what's happening? So what's our prediction for the coronavirus when it enters our cells? What's going to happen?
It's going to change the codes in the DNA.
So typically that's what would happen, right? But with coronavirus, it doesn't need to go to the DNA. It doesn't need to go into the nucleus. It just needs to enter the cell. And so why do you think that is? Why does it just need to enter the cell instead of go to the nucleus?
Because it's designed differently. I don't know.
It is good. No, you're getting closer. And others can feel free to jump in, right? And so yes, it is designed differently. It is different. It uses RNA, right? So it doesn't need to go to DNA because it doesn't need to make a replication of itself, a complementary strand. It is already RNA. So all it needs to do is go to the ribosome, and the ribosome is going to read it and not realize that it's not its own cell's DNA, right? So they're just going to go ahead and read it and then make the proteins for it and reproduce it for it. Okay, so let's go ahead and watch. I want to go back because remember I told you this video really pulls in a lot of what we've learned. So we just talked about the ribosome. The ribosome reads the RNA that was just deposited from the virus, and then it builds its own protein. So it's using our body to do the work for it. It's putting, the DNA or the RNA, excuse me, from the coronavirus is put into the cells. It goes to a ribosome. The ribosome reads it, creates those proteins so that it can be recreated. And so now what we're happening is they just talked about one of those organelles. Remember, we learned about organelles in first quarter. And that first quarter organelle was really specifically talking about how the different roles that those organelles play. And so they just showed us a really important part of the system. And that was where it takes place in the Golgi bodies. So let's watch. So this is a lot of information, and it talks really quickly about how lungs work. So I'm going to try to explain it really fast. So the basics of what you need to know, they were just talking to you about the different sections of the lungs. And when you are inhaling, you are breathing in a lot of the oxygen. Remember, what is the oxygen used for in our bodies? Why do we need oxygen? What's that process called that allows us, that like the whole reason we breathe oxygen in and breathe carbon dioxide out? What is that process that we need oxygen for? Really important. If we don't have this, we can't function. Remember that process? We learned about it in the beginning in quarter one. It's what we need in order to take glucose and turn it into ATP. Anyone remember? Okay. It's something called cellular respiration. Close, Avery, so close. Yes, cell different. You were very, very close. So cellular respiration is why we need oxygen, right? And so we get oxygen because we breathe it in through our lungs. It goes into these different chambers like the video shows, and then it goes into our alveoli and it meets with the blood cells. And that blood cells have the hemoglobin, right? That allows us to take that oxygen and then exchanges it for carbon dioxide, which is a byproduct in the Krebs cycle during cellular respiration, right? So just bringing in and connecting all the things that we've learned and how they interact with each other, right? So because of, right, we breathe out carbon dioxide because that's what gets changed when we're doing cellular respiration. And so we need this oxygen, and the oxygen meets the blood cells in these capillaries that it then goes and transmits to the rest of our body. So this is where I want to touch about how important it is to have evidence to back up your statements, right? In science in general, I only accept answers that have an explanation and backed up by science, right? So when you're taking your test, if you've ever lost points because you haven't explained yourself well or you didn't include evidence, this is why. It's so important for us to have evidence-backed statements and evidence-backed research before we can go and accept things, right? So even though, and remember, these videos are not to the most up to date, so we do have more research out there already, but we're still not sure exactly what happens when we have what's so-called immunity, right? We don't know what happens if there is a reinfection rate or not. We know that there has been cases of reinfection, and we know that there's also been cases where they haven't been reinfected. So even though we have more data and more evidence and more research now than the time of the video, we still need more before we can start really going through and saying things for certain. And that's how things are in general and should be when we're talking about the importance of making statements that are factual and based on evidence rather than assumptions. So we know that there is a vaccine, and the vaccine is actually different than what they're putting on here, right? So they typically in traditional vaccines, and this is what I was kind of talking about a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about an mRNA vaccine, which is what the vaccine for Pfizer and Moderna are. And we're going to talk about that again. I realize that wasn't the best time to try to teach it. Maybe when we get to the immune response, we can talk about it a little bit more. But really quickly, in this video, they talk about what traditional vaccines have looked like. Usually it's a weakened response, right? And the whole purpose is so that we teach our bodies what to look for in the future. So that way they already know what this specific shape is and they're ready to attack it. That's what those antibodies are so important for. So in this case, they were showing a weakened version, but that's not the kind of vaccine that was produced this time. This time we're using mRNA, which is similar to how this virus already, reproduces itself. And specifically the mRNA that the vaccines that Moderna and Pfizer are using are giving the instructions to the ribosomes to create just the outside shell of the vaccine. So you're not even actually getting the real vaccine into you, right? You're just putting in that RNA that allows the ribosomes to create that protein, that shape, that then your body goes and attacks and thinks it's a virus, but it's actually not. It's just the spikes. So that way it's prepared that if you do get it, you can fight it off right away.
Jedi cell trick.
Right? It's kind of amazing. And it's wild what people can come up with. I just think it's absolutely fascinating. But so that's basically how COVID is becoming, in a nutshell, that is COVID, right? That is why it's so important. It's interesting to understand. Now that we understand what viruses are a little bit more, I hope that this has helped in understanding coronavirus. Do we have any questions, comments, concerns? And let's really try to keep it focused on the scientific level. I don't necessarily, this is not the time or place to talk about the social aspect of COVID and the implications, but I'm happy to answer to the best of my ability and listen. So do you guys have any questions, comments, concerns about this?
I have a question.
Sure.
So we're hearing a lot about the Johnson & Johnson one. coming out. Is that one also an RNA-based one, or because that one's only a 1-dose one? Is that a different mechanism?
That's a very good question. I have not had a chance to do the research on the Johnson & Johnson one, but I know that was just recently, there was a deal made between them and a different company that also tried and was not successful. So I know that they're joining forces with another company, but I don't know the specifics about it yet. But that's a good question. I'll definitely have it researched in time for when we do talk about vaccines again.
Yeah, I was just curious because I was wondering, since it is a 1-dose vaccine versus a 2-dose like the other one, if it was going through a different mechanism, because maybe part of the reason why the other one with the RNA, the other two being 2 doses was possibly because of the RNA. I don't know. I'm not a scientist. I'm not even going to pretend like I understand.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure either. So I can definitely look into that though, because I think that's a really good question. Thanks, Rebecca. Are there any questions from anyone else? Comments? Concerns? Well, if you don't have any questions for me, then that's what I have for you today on Wednesday, on a beautiful Wednesday. So if you guys, feel free to reach out to me if you have questions, if you've got comments or concerns, and I will be here. I'll answer your questions. All right. But otherwise, thank you so much for joining me. Thank you so much for hanging out this morning. Yes, we can talk about that, Denny. Yes. Okay, great, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me. All right. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll hang on here for you.